It's hard to know where to start with this subject, but Martin Gilbert, who, as you know, is Winston Churchill's biographer, and he's the author of a number of books on the Holocaust and author of a forthcoming book on Muslim rules, a 1,400-year history. He wrote, "What do you think would have been the impact on the Israeli ability to absorb Holocaust survivors in the 1940s had the transfer agreement not occurred in the 1930s?"
The main value of the transfer agreement, this 1.9, 1.4 to 1.7 to 1.9 billion dollars, the equivalent dollars in today's money that was transferred over, was not trinkets. It was fundamentally infrastructure. When Jews came over during the Hitler period and en masse, and after the fall of the Third Reich, they came over in huge waves. Where were they going to live? What water were they going to use? Where were the roads going to be? Where were the lands? Had the transfer agreement never occurred in the 1930s, there would not have been the infrastructure to rapidly absorb all of these Jews. Let's remember this. The Nazi program was continued, as you well know, after World War II by the Arabs. They expelled approximately 1 million Jews from Arab lands in the years after the fall of the Third Reich. These people were not put into refugee camps. They were quickly absorbed. The name of the immigration ministry in Israel is called the Ministry of Absorption, and they absorbed these people. And so the answer to Martin Gilbert is that had Israel, the state of Israel, not been aided with this important impetus during the Depression years, it would have been, I think, difficult to absorb hundreds of thousands of Jews who came en masse during the years to follow. And this was, in fact, anticipated.
We have another question from Professor Samuel Edelman in Chico, California, who's the Executive Director of Scholars for Peace in the Middle East. He asks, there were other transfer agreements across Europe, such as one in Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary. Why didn't those succeed in transferring more Jews to Palestine?
Well, this is true. There was a transfer agreement in Italy. There was a transfer agreement in Czechoslovakia, in Romania. They each had their own financing schemes. And as the situation became more dire for the Jews in Europe, remember Hitler went into Czechoslovakia and he went into Austria and he began to take over Europe. The Zionists rushed frantically to set up more transfer agreements to save the Jews, because you must remember this very important statement, and I will quote you a phrase you know well, that Chaim Weizmann said, the world is divided into two places. Those places where Jews cannot live and those places where Jews cannot go. Most people think that Evian is just water you buy at the store. The Evian Conference lives with us in 1938 as what to do with hundreds of thousands of refugees, where the doors were shut. So Palestine was the only door open to the Jews. They weren't allowed into most of the nations of the world. So these transfer agreements had the possibility to transfer hundreds of thousands of more Jews. Romania, Hungary, most of the Hungarian Jews were wiped out in transports. They were organized in Hungary by one of the members of the board of directors of IBM, Edmund Wiesenmeyer. And imagine if these Jews had come by the boatload, literally, into Jewish Palestine. What happened? The war happened. Economics stopped. International trade became illegal. And the Zionists were not able to continue transferring these monies out in an effective and meaningful fashion. And so the war caught up with the transfer agreement before the transfer agreement could catch up with the genocide.
Professor Byron Sherwin of Spertus College, the author of many books on ethics and most recently The Life Worth Living, who was also, you mentioned the scholar who first told you about the transfer agreement, asks, you first heard about the agreement in an interview you did with me in the 1970s. I recall that when I told you about it in very general terms, you found it hard to believe that it actually happened. Now, after all your research, writing, and thinking about it, do you still find it hard to believe that it happened?
I didn't believe it happened in those days because I wasn't smart enough to know that it happened. I wasn't wise enough to know. I'd barely been out of Chicago. The march in question was one in Skokie, where my parents lived. It was just outside. If I was presented with this information now, I would believe it in an instant. I would have never believed that IBM would have had a 12-year pact, a widespread commercial coalition with the Third Reich to identify the Jews and even to create the basis of the Auschwitz tattoo. I would have never believed that the Rockefeller Foundation would have financed a program that sent Mengele into Auschwitz. I believe all of these things now, and I believe them because of the trial by fire that I had when I did the transfer agreement.
Professor Sherwin offers a second and very penetrating question. If the revisionist Zionists led by Vladimir Jabotinsky and Menachem Begin had been controlling the Jewish agency instead of Chaim Sorov, would there have been a transfer agreement? Would there have been German reparations to the State of Israel in the 1950s? And what might have been the economic and political outcomes for the State of Israel in its very early history?
Well, I'm constantly asked what-if questions on the transfer agreement. What if the boycott had succeeded? What if the transfer agreement had never been there? But here's one I think I can answer. And it's very dangerous. If is the sketchiest word in history. What if? I believe if the revisionists had controlled the transfer agreement, the Jewish agency at the time, I doubt very strongly that there would have been a transfer agreement with the Nazis. Now, it's important for me to explain here the delicate fabrics of the revisionist movement. They had actually good relations with the fascist Italian regime because they believed in a very strict organization. They believed in that, but I do not believe, based upon the immense vituperative reaction of the revisionists, that they would have ever allowed the Zionist organization and movement to cut a deal with the Nazis. They would have rather fought them, and they did fight them. And by the way, from that you can extrapolate on your own what the economic consequences would be. Now, would there have been reparations to Israel? Those reparations were actually calculated in 1938 by Nachum Goldman. I had access to his unprocessed papers at the American Jewish Archives in 1938. And 1938, before the war broke out, years before Auschwitz was established, the Zionists were already anticipating the worst. Why? Because they were realists. Because when Hitler said we're going to destroy the Jews, they actually paid attention. And they actually went out and did mathematical calculations on Nachum Goldman. I have the report. I've never mentioned it until this moment, on what the anticipated destruction, economic and human, would be if Hitler succeeded. And Hitler almost succeeded. He succeeded 99% in many countries, and he was stopped, but just barely.
You mentioned 1938. That was also the year of Kristallnacht. We're coming up on the 71st anniversary in another week or so.
And you wrote a distinguished book on Kristallnacht.
Right. And one of the things I found in my book, 48 Hours on Kristallnacht, was that even after seeing what went on, the U.S. government wasn't willing to actively rescue Jews. What did you find in your book and your research about the U.S. government's position back in 1933 in the time of this agreement?
Well, I think that the doors began closing for the Jews very quickly after the first months of 1933. There were refugees everywhere. We're talking about South Africa. We're talking about We're talking about Australia. It was very common for Jews in Germany to escape to Austria. And in 1938, they went from Austria to Czechoslovakia, and then the Germans followed them there. And from Czechoslovakia, they went to France, and then the Germans took over France, and in a bifurcated fashion. And so it was the Jews. When Chaim Weizmann said, "The world is divided into places where Jews are not allowed to be, and not allowed to go," it was the reality, and this was the dire challenge of the Zionists. There's an important dichotomy here. Are we going to make an effort to restore Jewish civil rights, or to rescue Jews for national rights? Either you're going to take $1 to keep a Jew where he is and help him get through the starvation imposed upon him. We're going to take $1 and transfer him. This is real politic. Remember, even the relief packages that were given to German Jews to get through starvation, those also went into the German economy. This is too complex to be black and white, and too complex for, it was almost too complex for me. That's why it took about 5 years to figure out.
Walid Ferris in Washington, D.C., who is an expert on Middle East affairs and the author of The Confrontation, Winning the War Against Future Jihad, asks, what do you think would have been the impact or lack of it on the Israeli economy and modern Israel if there had never been a transfer agreement?
There are many institutions today, such as Mekorot, the water company, which are taken for granted. These are infrastructural companies, and these companies occurred due to the investment that came over the transfer of assets. Now, it's common for some people to say, well, the transfer agreement did not rescue people, it rescued money. That's not true. It rescued people. It's true that the rescue of the individuals was metered out in cadence with the purchase and distribution of Nazi goods. But the fact of the matter is, they had to buy these goods in order to rescue the people. Now, what's interesting is, when the Jews were in concentration camps, they didn't say, "I'm German." They didn't say, "I'm Polish." They said, "I'm a Zionist. I wish to live." And the Zionists endorsed that. Jews have a right to live, and they saved the remnant, and they saved the remnant with the gun to the head. And that gun has never been removed from the temple, even though it's gone an inch or two away. The gun is still always cocked, and if I could just put an asterisk in for modern times, we still have today the Iranians trying to do in 12 minutes what Hitler could not do in 12 years, which is wipe out the Jews. And so the Zionists understood that there needs to be a strong Jewish state so that Jews have the same national aspirations other groups do.
Martin Cohen, a student in Jerusalem, asks, why did so many other historians fail to write about the transfer agreement and the anti-Nazi boycott?
They didn't want to. The transfer agreement was understood. There were several treatises in German and in Hebrew academic circles. It's not like today, where somebody does a master's thesis and puts it up on the internet, and suddenly 1 million people have access to it. When I went to the Leo Baeck Institute in New York, and I looked at the user guide, the finder's aid, and I said, where are the, I said, the files are supposed to be in this folder. Where are they? They're not in this file. They're not in this cabinet. Where are they? He said, they're underneath my desk. And he gave them to me. The book tried to do what many historians does not seek to do, which is to be all-encompassing on a narrow topic, instead of doing a very slender matter. And so I had to work not in 1 or 2 archives, but in 20 or 30. And I had to put all this together. And this was how this was the invention of the Edwin Black approach to Holocaust documentation, never to look at one place but 20 places and to put it all together in a giant puzzle. But the short answer is why they didn't want to, why they didn't do it, they didn't want to.
Subject of the boycott, Joyce Nelson in New York, another reader asks, was the anti-Nazi boycott just a boycott of Jews, or was it bigger than that?
It was way bigger than that. It was never called a Jewish boycott. There were Catholics involved. Some of the greatest figures in the New York Archdiocese and Boston Archdiocese were involved. The Polish were involved. Labor unions were involved. The Protestant community was involved. The organizers of the boycott against the Nazis were very careful to sculpt this as not just a Jewish tragedy, but one which was threatening the world. You know what they say? The Jews first and everybody else second. And that's why they did it the way they did. It was extremely credible. But then when the Jewish organizations backed off the boycott because of the transfer agreement, it was left to a bunch of unsupported, random people who for years walked up and down the streets with protest signs and still carried the torch, and I'm glad that they did. Both were necessary. We needed to protest the Hitler regime, and we needed to save the Jews. I am not unhappy that both occurred.
Well, Kenneth Babu in Fresno, California, a computer programmer asks a related question. Granted what you're saying about the importance of the boycott, he wonders, did the Zionists cooperate too soon and for too little?
People need to understand the minute-to-minute life in Nazi-dominated Germany. If there was a Zionist who pushed too hard on his German negotiator, he could be killed. He could be sent to a concentration camp. There was a limit to how far the Zionists could play their own cards. And the best card that they had, the best card, was that people over there who we can't control, these American Jewish organizations, are protesting by the hundreds of thousands and bankrupting your companies, which were falling by the wayside, and we have the ability to circumvent that. So from the Nazis' point of view, they were dividing the Jewish community with the transfer agreement, as well as serving all these other interests that I've discovered. No, they didn't do too little too soon. They did as much as they could, as soon as they could, but they did it in a different set of modalities.
A student in Berlin, Dennis Katz, asks, did the Zionists think that Jewish Palestine would be safe from the Nazis, or were they afraid that given Hitler's designs on the Middle East as well, that that would also be a dangerous place?
I think it was always understood by many that that Hitler thought of Palestine as a great big prison camp for the Jews. They'd be put there in Palestine, and then they could take over the Middle East. But I think the Zionists thought, let's save the Jews on Monday, and we'll figure out what happens on Friday. You know, it's always been a Jewish aspiration. We don't want to be killed before Shabbos.
Yeah. Well, let's finish with a last question from Joseph Myers, a retired teacher here in Montreal. How did you work on the transfer, or how did your work on the transfer agreement affect you personally, and why is this one event in Washington your only event on this book when you speak so often on your other books?
Well, it's an appropriate final question. It affected me personally in that it set me off on a circumnavigation of the world of evil. And as circumnavigating the world of evil and injustice against the Jews and other groups, the further I go, the more I end up at the same point. And I always end up where I started. So it's done that to me. As to why this is my only event, because I choose to.
want to thank Rabbi Weinblatt for a stimulating discussion, and Edwin for a very important book, which even 25 years later, as you say, still covers and offers a very powerful message for us. Thank you.
And thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mitch.
Am Yisrael Chai, the children of Israel still liveth.
Amen.